Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us to our event, Urban Open Space and Strategies in Between Architecture and Open Space Planning, the new book edited by Dr. Carolin Mees. My name is Kristin Reynolds and I'm the chair of the Food Studies program at the New School. I want to start by thanking those who helped make this program possible this evening. Shaked Landour was Assistant Director of Community Engagement at the Schools of Public Engagement at the New School, and Mike Harrington, who's the Assistant Director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center, one of our event sponsors tonight. The program is also being supported and sponsored by the Parsons School of Constructed Environments and Parsons School of Design Strategies. So I thought I could begin by just saying a few things about the Food Studies program at the New School. It is a bachelor's program which is situated in the program for adults and transfer students in the Schools of Public Engagement at the New School. The program has a BA and BS options with concentrations in 3 areas: culture, media and communication, health and the environment, and policy and politics. The program also accepts credits from certain culinary institutions, and some classes are also available to the public through our open campus. We have a number of events in food studies throughout the year, and some are co-hosted by other programs and schools in the university, like tonight's event. In a few minutes, I will show a slide that tells you where you can find out more information about our program and our upcoming events. So before we go any further, I would like to say a few things about housekeeping. First, the event, as you know, is being recorded. We ask that everybody who's not speaking keep their mics off. Please use the chat window through questions that you might have during the panel session, and we'll hold most questions until the end. The moderated Q&A will take place after the panel discussion. And here's the slide where I tell you if you would like to find out more about special public programs at the New School, you can see this website, events.newschool.edu, or if you would like information about our program, email us at foodstudies@newschool.edu. So a few words about the rhythm of the event. We'll begin with an introduction from me to our Food and Public series, of which this is the first this evening. Dr. Mees will give an introduction of the book and introduce the panelists. And then we'll move into panelist presentations and the moderated discussion, closing out with Q&A from the audience. So I'd like to read a brief introduction to this Food and Public series. For some who are less familiar with the fields of food studies and food systems, the word food may conjure images of the material food that we eat. This is, of course, an important aspect of the food system, as well as studying, researching, and working to make it more sustainable and equitable. For example, working to increase food access and food insecurity under climate change and rising inequality. But food studies and food systems step beyond the materiality of food itself. They include and attend to rural and urban agriculture, the food supply chain, labor and worker rights, and cultural foodways, to name a few. I'm sure that many of us have heard or thought about food as a way to bring people together around a dinner table, for example. Dr. Kyle Powles-White at the University of Michigan is among many indigenous scholars who have written about the understanding of food not only as a way to foster a relationship, but that food, in fact, is itself relationship between peoples and the earth. As he states, quote, depending on the peoples, food actually refers to different conceptions of collective self-determination. These points underscore the fact that while food and its consumption can be personal or individual, it is at once social and often public. Studying food can be about the food we eat, but it is often also about systems thinking, the public sector, and community. So our fall series on food in the public at the New School centers these ideas. Tonight's event, about which you're about to hear much more, focuses on strategies that are opening up urban spaces and food production through participatory design and architecture. Later this fall, we'll welcome additional food scholars, culinary leaders, writers, and activists to share their insights on how food and the public can and do connect to create a more just and equitable system. And so in closing my comments, I'd like to tell you about our next event on November 15th, which is called Remembering Waxman. Waxman, who passed away earlier this year, founded the bookstore Kitchen Arts and Letters in New York in 1983. It quickly became a crossroads for researchers, writers, chefs, and home cooks. He was also a great home cook himself, who was famous for his versions of traditional Jewish dishes. And so this event on November 15th is an opportunity for those who knew him to express appreciation for him and for members of the public to learn more about his life and work. So we invite you to join us at that event. You will see the link on the slide, and we will pass along information to you after the event as well. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce and then pass the mic to Dr. Carolin Mees. Dr. Mees is a part-time adjunct professor at Parsons School of Design at the New School, and she also teaches classes in our food studies program. With her studio, Mees Architecture, she has focused since 2005 on community-based architecture, design, and open space planning. She also currently teaches at the Technical University in Berlin's Institute of Planning, Design, and the Environment, and researches on shared urban open spaces with the support of the Alexander of Humboldt Foundation and the Berlin Senate of the Environment, Traffic, and Climate Protection. So I will pass it off to you, Carolin.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you for the chance to present the book and have a panel discussion with 5 of the authors of the book, and this support by all the other schools at the New School. Thank you for that as well. So this book was published by Jovis. Actually, it was just came out in print and is available online. And the focus of our collaborative project here was to discuss strategies in between architecture and open space planning from a transdisciplinary perspective. I invited as the editor 14 different authors to contribute from their perspectives on the topic of urban open space, and the investigation was part of my research, focusing on add-ons, like I call it, to an urban open space. So we were discussing a range of micro and macro perspectives and seeing how these perspectives offer strategies for collaborative, multi-coded urban spaces at the intersection of architecture and open space planning. So the center of this discussion was commonly used and designed open spaces as anchor points in the city, and a possible response to the consequences of urbanization and climate change, as well as to the presence of social and cultural differences. So this book explores the role of add-ons in urban open spaces as specific components for the production of food, water, energy, and materials, as well as for economic and social resources. It asks how these added elements create more resilient and sustainable urban spaces by responding to the needs and preferences of residents and by forming connections to the surrounding urban environment. As Kristin said, this book has been supported by Alexander of Humboldt Stiftung and the Berlin Senate, and had included a case study also focusing on Berlin. This is one of the book launches focusing on the English-speaking authors, and there's another book launch in December focusing on the German authors. So 14 authors coming from various countries, European and North America, Canada. So thank you for them, those who are present today to contribute to this panel discussion and book launch, as it is Nevin Cohen, June Komissa, Gundula Proksch, and Mark Gogoleski, and Annie Bellows. And we will see from these discussions focusing on a couple of the chapters of the book, which is production of food in the city, production of water, energy, and material in the city, and production of economic resources in the city. So we'll start with Nevin Cohen, focusing on crisis farming.
Thank you, Carolin. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'll speak for just 5 minutes, but happy to answer questions during the Q&A. I've been researching a project in New York City called Farms at NYCHA for 6 years now. These are large-scale urban farms built in the center of 6 New York City Housing Authority developments throughout the 5 boroughs. And for those of you who are not familiar with New York City, the Housing Authority houses 500,000 New Yorkers. So it's like the equivalent of a mid-sized American city in and of itself. So social housing in New York houses among the most vulnerable people in New York City, and a collaboration of public and NGO entities came together to create this program, which uses the skills of youth who live in public housing, pays them with federal funds through a program called AmeriCorps, and enables them to produce food for the residents of these 6 public housing developments, which together have about 18,000 residents living in them. And what I wrote about in the book was the role that these played in during the COVID pandemic. But I'd like to just back up for a second and explain that these farms at NYCHA were designed to produce not only food, but many co-benefits. And as many people in this meeting know, urban agriculture is not about the food, it's about all of the different co-benefits that these farms produce, including education, nutrition, guidance, cohesion among the residents. And these operate as civic spaces within what were really unlandscaped and undesigned and underutilized public spaces within the public housing developments. During COVID, these spaces were particularly important, although the pandemic really curtailed what could be grown in these farms. The organization Green City Force, which hires and supervises and trains the young farmers, pivoted to growing vegetables that needed less tending, like greens, engaged the youth in safe public presentations, and distributed the vegetables not from the weekly farm stands that they had before the pandemic, but through local food pantries that were able to distribute the food safely. And so while the pandemic sort of was a temporary setback, the farms at NYCHA really provided a really critical source of food and community empowerment to the developments when they were most needed. The farms at NYCHA were one project within an international study that I've been involved in called Food, Energy, Water Meter, that has involved studying urban agriculture, not only in New York, but in Germany, Poland, France, and the UK. And I'd like to put in the chat an article that we just published that talks about how all of the farms and gardens that were part of this larger study also pivoted during the pandemic to really engage in new activities and activities that were safe but enabled the gardens to persevere. And so the lesson here is, I think, twofold. One, that farms in the city can actually provide a wide range of ecosystem services that can actually address various crises, ecological crises, as well as social and health crises, and also that they are resilient forms of activities and spaces that can pivot during crises to persevere. So I'll end there, and hopefully we'll have a more discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Nevin. Any short questions for Nevin? Otherwise, we'll continue.
Sorry, the slides didn't advance, but I just want to show the second slide.
Yes, I wasn't sure when you.
And all this shows is that the activities persisted, but safely. So the people in this slide are harvesting greens, not for distribution at farm stands, but to food pantries, and they're wearing masks and they're staying safely apart. So despite the pandemic and despite the crises that communities that are low income and particularly vulnerable faced, the farms were able to persist. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks again. I was not moving on, but now I am next to June Komissa, also Dr. June Komissa from Ryerson University. Actually, I didn't really introduce you, Nevin, so sorry about that. Missed out on that. So, June is professor and associate chair at the Department of Architectural Science at the Ryerson University. And Nevin, you introduced yourself before, but I want to catch up on this. So Nevin Cohen is associate professor at the School of Public Health and director of the CUNY Food Policy Institute. So June, back to you. Thank you for joining.
Good evening. Thank you, Carolyn. So edible planting can be a statement or even a strategy to address the crises of climate change, increasing population, food insecurity, increasing urban density in some places and shrinking cities in others. What you see in this slide is Lafayette Greens, which is in a downtown Detroit lot, made vacant when a previous mayor in the late 1990s thought that imploding an historic high-rise would be a sign of progress. Detroit, which is long a shrinking city, is now undergoing a renaissance with many strategies for redevelopment, and one of them is very prominently urban agriculture. So what you see here is both an ornamental and teaching garden that in its small urban space includes other amenities, including a demonstration bioswale and space for community events and space to have lunch outside. And here, the not-for-profit Green Corps, which is across the city of Detroit, has introduced youth to the many skills required for keeping productive gardens. And in this way, the initiative spreads urban agricultural practices across the region. And it shows what you can do to produce food in land that may also have been contaminated. There was a high rise here after all, because it's entirely raised beds that don't touch the underlying soil. Could I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So this is a European example also of a small park. It's a little bit larger than the previous one that I discussed in the Edible Park chapter. And this is Jardin des Leducs in Switzerland. And the entire slope that you see here is planted with local crops, including all 47 representative varieties of regional grapes. And in this way, it educates visitors and people who live there about the regional produce. And this is not just a productive and educational park, but it also serves as a green roof for a parking structure underneath, where you can see a small section in the lower right-hand part of the slide. And so the green roof for the parking structure underneath is not the first of its kind. Many cities have underground parking garages, and some of these are covered with green roof parks, and you can see them in Millennium Park in Chicago and Post Office Square in Boston. So increasingly, cities have been instituting regulations that require or encourage green roofs because of the many benefits that, beyond the aspects of potential parkland, help to mitigate urban heat island effects and produce some cooling in the summer and minimize heat loss in winter. And in this case, it greatly reduces stormwater runoff, which would flow here into Lake Geneva, causing a lot of pollution. So this project demonstrates what roofs could become, both parks and paths to the waterfront here and centers for growing food. Can I have the next slide, please? Thanks. So this third example is Les Jardins du Museum in Toulouse, France. And it's within a huge park. And it is a project of the city's Natural History Museum. It showcases edible plants from all over the world and focuses on learning by doing programming that ranges from gardening to discovering nature to cooking, with workshops for all age groups and school groups that come in. And the focus is on total accessibility for everyone. They have braille signage and wide walkways and an accessible bridge passageway that you can see in the image there. And this is really part of the commitment to outreach that this garden has. The vast park beyond it could certainly contain a lot more space for true productive gardening. But I can say from personal experience that as a volunteer at a demonstration garden in Toronto, that shifting from demonstration to serious food production is really possible. And this happened in many places during the pandemic, including where I volunteer. So for 2 seasons, Toronto's Allen Gardens, which is a demonstration garden, contributed weekly harvest to nonprofits, which distributed food locally during 2 summer growing seasons. So combining demonstration and attractive gardens with vastly increased production, I think was a much needed pandemic innovation. Good design must be key to community acceptance of edible landscaping, but stewardship through community groups and garden professionals is what makes the design flourish through the growing season, becoming a vital contributor to food sovereignty.
That was the last slide. Thank you, June. Seeing if there's questions for you, or we keep them to the end. Thank you so much for that. We're moving forward. If there's no question, that was moving on to Professor Gundula Proksch, who's an associate professor at the Department of Architecture and director of the Circular City and Living Systems Lab at the University of Washington in Seattle. And title is the next presentation, Productive Urban Open Spaces, Water, Energy, and Organic Materials for the Circular City. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline, for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. So the chapter, this is actually the capture of the title of the chapter, looks at how urban open spaces can produce or make available water, energy, and organic raw materials. It builds on my research on circular city principles that are part of the project City Food, which looks at the sustainable integration of aquaponics in cities. So when Caroline asked me for this book to explore the production of water, energy, and materials related to open spaces, I realized I had looked at this issue at the urban scale and at the net positive building scale, but not specifically for open spaces. We have great examples, as June just showed, for open spaces that produce food. We have open spaces that mitigate, for example, stormwater, but there are very few examples where open spaces make available resources for other uses. So that was my research question. Which productive spaces that make these resources available exist already, and what kinds of strategies did they use? So this study is based on an amended water, energy, food nexus, the transdisciplinary approach for the sustainable and equitable delivery of these resources. Here, the focus is shifted to water, energy, and organic raw materials. And the nexus looks specifically on the interdependency of these 3 sectors. So for example, in this diagram that I added here, it shows that water and energy, for example, are inputs for the production of raw materials. Next. So, and in addition, I sorted the case studies that I found based on circular city related strategies of collection, recovery, and biological cultivation. So the table that you now see basically contains the most representative case studies I found and some key information about them. For each category, water, energy, and organic raw materials, it was important to not just look at one strategy that's mainly the dominant one, but to look at all three options: collection, recovery, and cultivation. In the energy section in the middle, you probably see this the clearest. We have several technologies that collect energy, such as PV panels, solar thermal, and micro wind turbines. We can recover energy from heat and organic waste, and we can cultivate biomass as a source of energy. Next. And then here, finally, some examples for the design integration of these infrastructures in open spaces. The most challenging aspect I found was that urban open spaces are relatively small and often very intensively used, which is great. That's what we want for our cities, but it conflicts with the economy of scale that these infrastructures need. So regardless of this challenge, we should try to integrate these productive systems in open spaces. Placing them in the everyday environments creates awareness and reaches people to generate social, cultural, educational, and community benefits. And the introduction of these productive infrastructures with public life will express our value to place growing interest in sustainable, circular and equitable cities.
Great, thank you. Thank you for putting this all in such a short presentation. Same for June and Nevin before. It's hard to get all these information into 3 slides. So thank you for putting that together, Gundula. And I'll see if there's questions right now. I think not at the moment. So we would just continue and going on to Dr. Mark Gogolewski, who is professor and chair at the Department of Architecture Science, Ryerson University in Toronto. And the focus of his chapter in the book is Urban Harvest, Building from Waste.
Thank you very much, Carolin. And it's great to hear all these presentations of different perspectives on urban space. I find it really interesting. I have cheated and I have more than 3 slides, but I'm going to go through them fairly quickly and ask Carolin to move them forward quite quickly. The interest that I bring to this is how we use materials in the city, and building on what Gundula was just talking about, how do we build circular processes for the way that we use materials? So these materials on screen now are all materials that have been used once and have found a second use. And this is what I'm really looking at as the potential of for buildings, for urban spaces, for the types of cities that we create, both from an aesthetic and from a functional point of view, but also from an economic point of view, of trying to tap into the potential that materials provide by finding ways of reusing them. So if we can have the next slide. I just wanted to make the point to start with. This is a sculpture by Anthony Gormley, a well-known sculptor in the UK. And this is a waste man built out of all waste components. And you can see on the right-hand side, all the different bits of urban waste that he's collected up from a small city in the south of the UK and created this quite significant sculpture. You can see on the left-hand side a man working on the sculpture, and so you can get an idea of the size of this structure. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that he then burnt the whole thing down. And the point of this was to say that this is waste. This is fundamentally stuff that we're quite happy to throw away. But as soon as we make something artistic, make something that has an enhanced value because of the artistic component to it, then we're shocked that it's being thrown away, that it's being discarded, that it's being burnt and is no longer valuable. And so these components that we think of as waste also can have great value if we put creative input into them. So if we go to the next slide, I look at buildings such as this. This is a building in London, UK, near where I grew up, which we wouldn't want to knock it down. We want to maintain these types of buildings. Generally, we put value on cultural heritage at the scale of the building, maybe not as often as we would like to, but nevertheless, we recognize that. If we go to the next slide, we see materials, whether it's timber, whether it's clay components, others, which we're quite happy to discard. Even though they are beautiful components, beautiful materials, we can create beautiful things out of them, and we can get a lot of functional use out of them and create spaces and environments out of these materials. We are quite happy to discard them because we don't put the effort into recognizing their economic, their social, their cultural, and their environmental value. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to run through a few ideas of projects that actually try and address this. And fundamentally, what we're looking at is how do we look at materials in a circular city? How do we recognize the stocks of materials that are in the city already today and make use of them, rather than looking at materials that come in and out of our cities? Materials flow analysis is a scientific approach to actually measure the flow of materials and resources into and out of a system. And a system might be a city or a part of a city. And we're quite used to bringing in new materials to create our built environments, and quite used to discarding old materials. And there's huge flows of materials that come in and out of our cities. But if we recognize that a city is actually a huge stock of materials, cities are, you could call it a materials bank or a materials store. How do we actually tap into that material store and make built environments, urban spaces that actually use those materials? This is what I'm really interested in. This is what my chapter focuses on. So this is an example of a project in Denmark, in Copenhagen, by the Lendager group called Resource Row, where they identified there was a lot of brick buildings that were being demolished. And rather than demolish those buildings, they developed a system of cutting out these brick panels and reusing them in a new building to create the new building out of these brick panels. There's a whole lot of other resources that they reused, and this is a very interesting project and a very interesting practice that does a lot of work on reused materials. But they fundamentally look at how to create a built environment, an architecture, an urban design strategy based on those materials. If we move to the next slide, this is a project from Boston. I'm sure you're familiar with the Big Dig, where they buried a big highway. An architect and an engineer took some of the components and to create first an individual house and then housing projects within the city based around these components, looking at how to create not just the buildings, but the spaces around the buildings out of these components. So the next slide shows a strategy that certain architects in the Netherlands have adopted called a harvest map, where they actually start a project by mapping all the different resources, circular resources that are available in that location or within a certain distance of that location, and designing around those materials what is available to them, rather than starting with a catalog of brand new materials. And then they evolve different types of projects based on those materials. So I'm showing this cable reel on the right-hand side because they identified this as a very useful resource for developing a cladding material for a building, for instance. So to finish off, if we go to the final slide, I think what we're looking at is opportunities for a new type of urbanism and a new type of architecture based on these available materials and resources. Architect Jean Gang talks about form follows availability, to identify availability of materials and then work with those materials. We need to develop an infrastructure that can make this happen. It's not just going to happen on its own, but that is slowly happening in certain locations. I wanted to just finish with this slide to show that large significant buildings can actually be realized in this way. This building envelope is a series of reused windows collected from around Europe, oak window frames, which were repurposed into this structure to demonstrate the collective spirit of the European Council by taking windows from all around Europe and using them in this way to create this extension to the headquarters building. So it just demonstrates the potential for large-scale implementation of these strategies and creating a different type of urbanism if we take this approach further. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to answer any questions later.
Thank you, Mark. Questions not right now. So that was a really interesting focus also again on circular economy and I think something you call also urban mining, and looking at building urban harvest building from waste. Now to focus on more economic production of economic resources and social resources. I continue giving it to Annie Bellows, who I collaborated on a paper. So we wrote a collaborative paper. Dr. Annie Bellows is professor of food studies and the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. So thank you, Annie, also for joining and talking about this chapter. Hope she can hear me.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to be here. Congratulations, Carolin, for getting out the book. I want to start by saying that this work is based on Carolin and I coming from very different spaces, architecture and sort of geography, food studies, in our conversations to move towards thinking about a human rights structure to gardening, one that is based in neighborhood resistance and participatory design. And in this presentation, I'm going to briefly introduce some of the theoretical background. Carolin will introduce the case study, and then I will briefly describe our ideas around a right to garden. So next slide, please. So basically, we're using two approaches, a human rights approach and a right to the city. Human rights being based in United Nations Universal Human Rights language, and a right to the city being more philosophically based from Lefebvre and others, sort of people's access to make and remake the city in their own image. So with the idea of land for people versus land for speculation. And so at the heart is the idea of neighborhood resistance and participatory design. And in the context of a human rights-based approach, there are fundamental systems of participation, accountability in terms of how a community can hold its local government accountable, non-discrimination, dignity, among others. And then the idea of land tenure, the ability to defend against the loss of homes and neighborhoods, against externalized power, which Carolin has a beautiful case study for. The commons being discussed quite a bit at this point. Again, the idea of self-determination to share and mold the physical form of community, neighborhood, communal kind of home and habitat. The collective is the opportunity to recreate this community in resistance to isolation, and to develop self-determining cooperative systems that actually make the space. And as was discussed so beautifully before, the idea of urban metabolism, which reflects upon human rights and right to food and right to gardening, to extend to the way a city breathes and moves and regenerates itself, the land, the water, the air, the material construction inside of it. And finally, also through social power in daily practices. The praxis of reading, of talking with neighbors, of making music, of hanging out and having a good time, where the energy moves is what creates the collective, not necessarily the tomatoes, but the practice of working and having fun together. So next slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. So we've been looking at the case study of design and participation of neighborhood resistance, and here at the community gardens movement in New York City, and then specific at the building of Casita, something that I've been researching for some time and been moving on forward from, but it's still very central to the understanding of design and participation or collaboration and neighborhood resistance, since it shows the land access, use, and tenure that comprise a central battle between locally based residents and those who exert control and are enriched by the global circulation accumulation of capital. Meaning it has been a movement since the 1970s and shows the will of the people to continue to use land in New York City as urban open spaces that are shared and outside of the pressure of capitalism in a city such as New York. And they have been successfully been using these spaces in their own determined way since the 1970s, which is over 50 years now, and has been a constant struggle to keep these spaces, but successfully so due to organization and participation, which is also shown in the expression of its design that is in these different community gardens or shared urban open spaces. And if you look at one of the examples that are found in gardens that are mainly used by Caribbean and Latin American communities, you find these casitas, these small self-built structures that are designed for social cohesion, food production, and also are age-inclusive recreations due to sharing skills among different demographics. As Annie already said, focusing on socialization and as a big part of this central structure in these gardens, but also a proof of political resistance and land tenure claims. And here is the example, if you look at the development of how city government looked at these structures as privatization of public open spaces over the years, over and over again, but there has been a way to manage this and to keep these structures as self-built and collaborative designs, as for example in 2007, when the city requested a design that for a variable kit for construction of these casitas, and that I collaborated on with a team of builders and community residents and architects, and we designed a traditional based design that then was affordable, sustainably built with standard materials and rather simple construction methods based on the traditional way of building. And that became a guideline that was open source, available by, on Green Thumb webpage to guide gardeners to deal with requirements that were put out to the city. So in that way, they continue to work in a shared way on these open spaces.
So, and I will just close by with our ideas towards a human right to garden. We really are looking at the crux of community land tenure and participatory design as the key points to be able to protect human dignity and to move towards self-determination in communities, particularly by most marginalized residential members. So we see 3 stages. at having a human rights-based framework approach, which can be exemplified between inclusive participation in design and planning decisions, a collaborative design and co-governance mechanism within communities to organize land use for shared open spaces and to foster communication among the community neighborhood and various public and private interest groups. And 3, anchoring plans, policies, and programs with participatory planning processes and moving towards an understanding of human right to garden that both works with international law under a human rights-based approach and benefits an expansion of understanding about human rights at the international as well as local level. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for all panelists for contributing to this. And I wanted to, before I have some questions myself, ask everybody to mute and see if there's questions that come up in the panel. Slides in the book, or is this a separate paper? No, we have everything as part of the book, but everybody, like, there was a question if these slides are in the book or is this a separate paper. I think for all of our presentations, they are part of everybody's research. So they are to some degree in the book. The book has longer and shorter chapters, but Nevin also put in a link to the elaboration, like, you know, further linking research. So there's definitely links in the book also that leads to other papers that have been written by all panelists. So if it's okay with the panelists, I would ask them all to come back on the, thank you, on the screen. So it's nicer to have everybody in view. I have a couple of questions myself, since we have been invited by Food Studies in collaboration with Parsons, support by Ted C. I was thinking it would be interesting to see if we can focus on the food production part of all our presentations, or if there is a connection to it, as Gundula has also mentioned, you know, like how can we bring it back into a discussion like that? So I would ask Nevin, what kind of food production focused urban open space design actually would, in your opinion, be helpful to respond to crises such as COVID-19 and its concomitant economic crisis? And I know you're not coming from the design necessarily, but you've been involved in this area for such a long time, and maybe you can add something to that.
Yeah. So first of all, I'd like to say that you know, Kristin Reynolds, the chair of Food Studies, and I wrote a book in 2016 called Beyond the Kale, which focused on all of the other aspects of urban agriculture that are so important besides food production. Yet, I think gardens and farms can be designed in ways that both mitigate and address crises, right? So there are many examples of urban agriculture design as a way to mitigate flooding from the climate crisis. And so I think we can focus on innovations that can actually both locate gardens and farms in ways that are strategic to address issues of flooding, and then can also mitigate climate change by reducing the heat island effect in cities. That's a very pragmatic approach. I think what the research in the Few-Meter project that I mentioned and put a link in the chat to a paper about showed was that urban agriculture can actually exacerbate as well as mitigate crises. So, for example, in places that are water stressed, the consumption of water in urban agriculture, if not addressed really carefully through design, can exacerbate water scarcity. And so we need to plan very carefully, and we need to understand the inputs as well as the outputs of urban farms. And that's what our research through life cycle assessment of various types of urban agriculture projects attempts to do. But then there's the social dimension. One of the findings in the Farms at NYCHA research that I've been doing is that these spaces can act as civic spaces, outdoor civic spaces. And in fact, the organization that has developed and run the Farms at NYCHA is turning these into sustainability hubs in the public housing developments that will be spaces that have solar charging stations that can educate people about the need to transition from carbon to greener energy sources, that will be major composting hubs, that will teach people about the need for a circular economy. And so these are all examples of how I think urban agriculture can be redesigned to both mitigate crises and also be better resourced to respond to crises like public health crises.
Yeah, thank you, Nevin. Also, thank you for mentioning you and Kristin's book. I think it would be great if you can add that to the chat. And for like bringing into context the NYCHA Farms, which is a really interesting project going on right now. And there's a question, could you elaborate more on urban agriculture? What types of soil and types of gardening farming could be used? I was wondering if I could pass this question on to maybe June or Gundula, who have next questions too, or who would volunteer on answering this question. Who would be up to this, or any? I'm not sure who would like to answer.
Perhaps both of us could answer.
Thank you.
I think it depends on the size of the lot and the climate that you're talking about. But I think it's very site specific. Several of the examples that I show in my chapter show container gardens, which help in an urban condition where the actual soil is not, it could be contaminated and has not been tested. So it's grown above the soil in the ground, and that way it becomes safe, and also it becomes something that is accessible for people who really can't bend over into to the ground level. So it really depends on the climate that you're talking about and the urban conditions and the size of the plot.
Thank you, June, for jumping into this answering. I had actually also the question for you, thinking about, and you've been presenting on it to some ways, and you have many more focuses in your research as well, but how could parks be turned into integrated productive landscape that contribute to food security? How can this be like really, much more intensely used in some way?
Well, I've been thinking about how the design aspect of these little parks that I show that food production versus parkland for recreation isn't an either or proposition, but using perhaps landscape architects and other designers' expertise, you could have a both and instead of an either or. The trees can be chosen to be fruit-bearing trees. The benches can be benches / raised beds. So an entire park can be designed to have a lot of food production within it. And the design actually helps with the acceptance by the general population. But I think that the key is what other people have talked about rather than me, which is community involvement and expertise, and also cooperation and by the city, allowing people to do this and not getting, basically, A, not getting in the way, and B, even devoting resources into making this happen, because they have to devote resources into maintaining parks anyway. So those resources can be used to maintain productive parks. So it's design, but it's also policy and community involvement.
Yeah, thank you, June. I actually would like to then continue asking Mark on his idea and then coming back to Gundula. But Mark, you had mentioned like the concept of using urban waste and building from waste, urban harvest, which is something that you mentioned in the book, comes from urban mining and the concept of gleaning. So do you see a way like, collecting or integrating a comprehensive design approach, which, suggests also addressing waste equals food in some way in this approach? Meaning like a circular systems thinking for design processes that are food, design, and architecture, urban planning focused?
Well, I think it all goes down to a sort of mindset and a fundamental different approach about how we create and use the resources that we need, whether it's building materials, whether it's food, whether it's energy, and the mindset which tries to put value on existing and tries to recognize the value of what we have. And I think this relates to all different types of resources that we use. And I think that some of the initiatives that are happening, or some of the activities that are happening at the moment, things like the big concern of embodied energy and embodied carbon, start to push us in the direction of really thinking about what we've already got, rather than assuming that everything has to be new. I think the idea of conservation in terms of buildings is obviously well established. It maybe doesn't happen as often as we would like sometimes, but is well established. But a more widespread approach to conservation of resources, I think, is the next step that we need to think about. I mean, sometimes when I talk in more detail to students and others about this, I talk about the idea of value, but not just financial value. What about value in terms of the social value, or the cultural value, or the environmental value of something? And we tend to get dominated by the economic sort of interpretation of value, but I think there are various other ways of thinking about value that we need to bring into the equation. And I think it does happen in some projects, but not in many others. I think there is, as Gundula and others have mentioned, there's an integration between the thinking around materials, around energy, around water, around food, which really, in an urban context, there are so many opportunities to connect these together and get synergies between them. And I think that's where we need to be going with this.
Yeah, thank you. I would give it to Gundula right afterwards, since you already mentioned. Maybe you want to just add to that in the
I agree.
question. Yeah.
Like as I said, I looked at this from the not so obvious perspective of not looking through food, but trying to really look at what's the potential for these places for us to collect or recover these essential resources. I think with the food, water, energy nexus, it becomes clear that these are also the inputs for food production, right? Water, energy, nutrients, which is sort of in the food section of the food, water, energy nexus. And looking not as urban gardens at something where we can just provide these resources from the municipal water supply, for example. If we think of this as more holistic and hopefully also really expanding on a much larger scale, we cannot do that anymore. And so water harvesting, many farms want to do it, but then they don't, because it's so easy to use the water that comes from the municipality, and really starting to think about the full integration of those resources that we need, and also to closing the loop, right? So not just I found an amazing composting operation in New York, right? So their community takes the food waste or the gardening waste to create new soil. So that's sort of also the initial, maybe most obvious recycling loop that is closed. But for in a city, it has to be done at a really high level of consideration of all the impacts. And when we do this in a rural area, not much happens when we start to compost. But if we do it in a city, a lot of other elements have to be considered. So I think it's important, and all these productive elements in the city have to be thought together and not separate from each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And I think you mentioned the Lower East Side Ecology Center for the compost operation, which just went out of operation because of capitalist forces and strange urban design decisions, was moved for a new park development. So I think that's a good transition going back to Annie. And here's a question by Joe Nasa. Thank you, Joe, for joining, who's actually also contributed to the book with a chapter and was so kind to give everybody else a space, since we don't have so much time to invite everybody today. I'm really glad you're here. Joe, if you want to ask your question, or you can, I'm not sure if you can actually unmute yourself, but I can also read it. Question to Annie regarding your call for gardening as human right. How would such a right accommodate the incredible variety in gardening practices, contexts, actors, and intentions?
Oh, thank you for that. You know, I want to link this also to a previous question about, or a previous comment about, you know, are there situations where there's neighborhood or community resistance to gardening because it makes space for homeless, and that, and it raises a fear in the neighborhood that, you know, they're not going to be able to control the social production of space. And I think that the whole notion of urban gardening and urban food forests, so planned food production and then also foraging opportunities is evolving. And I think that I'm working right now in Syracuse on looking at foraging codes around the country. And so, and I've started to sort of think about a right to garden also as sort of a larger space of public right of access to at least public spaces for a variety of things, including food production and taking food. So the diversity is something I think that a human rights-based approach is designed for, and it constantly reimagines itself as groups feel are pushed past exclusion to become included in the conversation. The way a right is defined becomes reimagined and reworked. And so I don't think that our initial, you know, recall for a right to gardening it can be considered sort of an endpoint. You know, it's like, this is what it should be, but rather it is opening it's insisting on opening a dialogue about access to land and participatory engagement with the uses of the land for and by neighborhood members. A principle inside human rights is that the emphasis, the policy emphasis always has to be on the most marginalized. And that's where the starting point is. So if that's in fact true, then inclusion is something that is that evolves. We're never there. We're never, and pretty soon, you know, the voices that start something, they need to move aside. Like our definition will need to move aside as a concept becomes better and better understood. I'm sorry, this will get me going. I think that kind of gets the point. So thank you, Joe, for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. Yes, we had a couple of questions here in the chat also. And one was maybe it's a little bit away from this. How does the privatization of common urban open spaces affect the ways that parks are changed in multi-purposeful gardens and climate mitigators? I think we touched on that in some way, but maybe somebody wants to add to this. So how does privatization affect multi-purpose uses of gardens and climate mitigators? Any volunteers on answering? Maybe giving it to June.
I'm not quite sure about the privatization of public space. There are several questions that kind of touch on this fear of homeless people walking through privatized public space, trying to get office buildings to grow food on their roofs. There are a lot of different issues involved in that. I was thinking about trying to answer part of the question about the fear of homeless people going into privatized public space or public-ish access private space. And the odd thing about food production seems to be that food growing is invisible to most people, including people who are houseless. The big threat to being able to harvest a crop is actually squirrels and other urban wildlife. Those are the bunnies and all sorts of things. But the other thing is that why are we afraid of people who are houseless? What we should do is, it's a whole other topic and a whole other book, but why aren't we housing people who have a right to housing instead of being afraid of them walking through the space? But the other thing also is that there is so much food growing in every city that is invisible to us. And there are these gleaning organizations, like in Toronto, there's a group called Not Far From the Tree that goes to public parks and also privatized spaces and picks apples and pears and other fruit to give to the homeless, shelters, to soup kitchens, and to the owners of the property if it's private. And then the pickers also keep some from themselves. And there's a huge amount. A student once asked me, why aren't we growing fruit trees on the Ryerson University campus in Toronto? And I said, oh, we have hundreds of them. You just don't see them. We have crab apples and we have service berries. And so that very year we called Not Far From the Tree, this gleaning organization, and they picked bushels of service berries, which they then gave to a lot of places that make food for the poor. So if food growing is so invisible that this seems to be an issue that they're making up entirely out of their heads. I'm sorry, I'm talking too long about this, but they're imagining a threat that doesn't really exist.
And in fact, at the farms in NYCHA, we've observed that the farms have activated what was officially public space, but because of poor design and upkeep, was essentially unused, and so prevented people from being able to enjoy the space. So I think the notion of private and public has to be really carefully considered. because the definitions aren't always clear and are flexible.
Yeah, thank you. That's important. In addition to it, always a question like who makes this distinction. So often it's put out by people that want to separate things that are not necessary to be separated in that regard. Maybe. Anybody wants to add any?
Yeah, just real quick. In Asheville, Asheville, North Carolina, there's a very well-known food forest there, and it's quite large, and it's right along a main travel corridor. And there are many people who will stay the night in the food forest, and the city and the supportive organizations refer to them not as homeless, but as travelers. And so that's part of a sort of rethinking about the diversity of people who might use space. And also one of the strategies then becomes design, how to make the space available for, or more comfortable for people who are afraid, more safe for persons who are travelers, even welcoming. And so, and it's an ongoing conversation, especially if you want community volunteers to be working there and to try to get past us versus them, that sort of dichotomy.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, any additions from the questions here in the chat? There was one more leading to a little bit of a different direction. I'm interested in overall life cycle of an urban garden. Is there discussions around water needed, other maintenance measures, labor, ensuring plant supply needed to upkeep the system, by how much the benefits outweigh these aspects long term? Maybe Gundula, I'm not sure who would like to answer. Any volunteers on this one? There's a question from Savi.
The question is often, who pays for the maintenance? Who, like, can the, does a community group that might want to run this need support? Partners generate networks that can support or that can give the capacity of potentially fundraise if there is a lot of infrastructure needed. If it is an existing, I think June mentioned it, and I think that's when you want to grow in soil, it's the biggest question is what's the quality of the soil, what you have to do. And so it starts really at what the situation is that this garden starts with and what needs to be added to it. And then, is like who is in charge of it? Who can, drum up support? So I think this is it's not only, I think, the quantity of investment that's needed, but it's also, ownership structures and potential support structures. Once any program that is supporting this community or the site has an interest in potentially situating educational programs there, changes the dynamic drastically, because then all of a sudden potentially there is additional input, it's not just the food growing, but it, so it's hard to answer, and it would not make that much sense to establish sort of a monetary amount that it is, but looking at bigger networks. And I think the more interconnected networks are in which these gardens emerge, the better they are off, the more longevity these sites have usually, instead of being just run by one group.
Yes, thank you. That's a tricky question of cost analysis versus social aspect. Is there is it quantifiable in that regard? It comes up a lot, I think, for Lisa. But I think, Evan, you wanted to add something to that?
Well, it also depends on what you're comparing it to. If you're comparing it to conventional rural agriculture, the numbers are very different. And but I think it's a useful exercise in designing urban agriculture and citing urban agriculture. One of the findings in our study is that potable water is has a big negative impact when you look at the greenhouse gas emissions from urban agriculture, and transportation has a big impact of the gardeners to the farm and to the farm stands. And so designing the farms to be accessible to public transportation and ensuring that people have bicycle access is important too. Those are things that we haven't really thought about very hard in thinking about urban agriculture, because the co-benefits are generally, what are the most important outputs of urban agriculture sites. But I think as people become more concerned about the displacement of potential development sites with urban farms, that data will be more important to collect, and we need to be able to actually calculate the benefits to communities that go beyond the food benefits and include sometimes hard to quantify social values.
Yes, thank you for that. And I would include more of our participants who are really have written well-known research, like Kristin Reynolds and Oliver Kellermas here has been in the field, Dr. Jo Nasa definitely, and others. Would be great to open this up more, but we have only a couple more minutes, so maybe you can add some more to the chat or unmute yourself and ask more questions if you like. Kristin, also most welcome to contribute. Otherwise, I think this was a really good discussion. And I thank you, Kristin, for this opportunity to host this with food studies, and you and your support. I see Mike Harrington was here or is still here. Thank you also for Ted C. And I would think we can also give it back to you, Kristin, unless there's more questions coming up.
Well, since you called me into the discussion, I will say one thing.
Excellent.
On the last of conversations, I wouldn't have, except for that you called me out. I mean, I think that the chapters that have been discussed so eloquently by the authors in the panel today, including yourself, Carolin, demonstrate another aspect of broadening public understanding about the potential benefits of urban open space and urban agriculture that could potentially in some way be quantified, but maybe not, or not. Maybe quantification isn't always the only way that this can be communicated. And so as I see and understand more from your chapters after your discussions here, and looking really very much forward to reading the book, the case studies, the images, the discussions of the multidisciplinary and multifunctional aspects of the various projects that you have discussed, I think exemplify different ways that we can collectively, those of us who are working in the field of trying to broaden awareness about the importance of these activities, add to that discussion, so that there's the important work that's being done in terms of quantifying. There's the important work that's being done in terms of, recognizing the human rights approaches and participatory design. And then sometimes the stories also need to speak for themselves. And I think that, again, as I understand this book does, also helps to do that. So those are my brief thoughts about that question.
Thank you for pulling this all together. Yes, I hope there's more collaborations and contributions on all these different perspectives on that. And I would thank you again, Kristin, and thanks everybody for contributing, making time for this tonight, and for joining us in this discussion on the chat too. So
Indeed.
make the recording available.
Thank
Just
you.
one more thing I will add. If folks are interested, I will reiterate that we will be having our next event on November 15th. I just put the link in the chat if you're interested in a quite different discussion about food and the public surrounding Waxman. And thank you, Carolin, for organizing this event. Thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you to our sponsors and everybody that has participated today. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.